Do roll call. Commissioner Ambrose?
Present.
Commissioner Lee?
Here.
Commissioner Smith?
Here.
Wonderful. Agenda item number 2, public comment on matters appearing or not appearing on the agenda.
Make it official for you. Thank you, Ethics Commissioners. My name is Ellen Lee Zhao. I am a public servant for San Francisco for more than 10 years. I am a SEIU 1021 union bargaining team member for government employees. Our union has more than 52% of the public employees. I am also the Director of Public Relations for the California Civic Grand Jury Association, the San Francisco chapter. As a public employee, I am trained to practice good government conduct. I am here as a resident for San Francisco for the last 30 years. I have been coming to Ethics Commission many times during 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. Today, I come before you, Ethics Commissioners, ask you to restore law and order. Ethics Commission Department was set up to fight corruptions in the government. The last time I was here talking to you, it was March 15, 2019. I reported to you we have a lot of possible corruptions within the electoral officers who purposely created laws that is welcome criminals and support drugs and drug dealers. For example, we have 25,000 drug abusers and users and sellers in San Francisco street. In the last 2 years, we have more than 400 homeless people die on the street because we have the laws that created purposely by the electoral officers. And we waste a lot of public dollars, we waste a lot of human lives. And we also provide free needles, 6 million a year. We're only able to collect it back about 2 million, which means more than half of the needle floating on San Francisco streets. It is illegal, but our government has been doing so, free illegal drugs. So I am here today and ask you to investigate super PACs that has been bought and paid by a few elites, election after election, and contaminate our good government practice. Today, I'm here to request the Ethics Commissioners to enforce the laws to protect our government, to protect our San Francisco, and make San Francisco safe and clean. And also, because we have so many people oppose illegal drugs and site injection for drugs and supporting the drug dealers, it's about time for you to step up. Because of the time, I'm not able to finish all my comments in here, so I'm going to give this to you as public record.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other public comment for agenda item number 2? Okay. Agenda item number 3 on the consent calendar, draft minutes for the Ethics Commission's March 15th, 2019 regular meeting. Okay, so we have a motion to approve and a second. All in favor? Aye. Okay, unanimous approval. Agenda item number 4, informational presentation and discussion of agenda item number 4, Public Financing Review Project, Phase 2 Findings and Recommendations.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Pat Ford, who would normally be here to present this item with the policy team, wasn't able to be here today given the switch of meeting dates. But I want to acknowledge and thank him, Brian Cox, and Tyler Field, who's also here today and can assist with discussion and questions that you might have as part of this report. To recap where we are today, this agenda item 4 and the information it contains is designed to bring forward our thinking about recommendations of a substantive nature to strengthen the public financing program that candidates for mayor and city board of supervisors are able to participate in. Just as a quick recap for those who might be joining the discussion at this point, following the issues on SF.gov TV or through later observation. The public financing program that we have here in the city, as you know, has a number of aims that it was created to establish. And part of the challenge for the city is to continually make sure those policy goals are balanced through the mechanics and the procedures that the program establishes. Some of the goals that the program requires is to support is to reduce time that candidates have to spend fundraising or believe they have to spend fundraising, and really encouraging them to spend more time voting, communicating with voters on issues that matter. Also, it encourages more, or is designed to encourage greater opportunities for candidates, including those of lesser means or modest means, or those who don't wish to spend their greater means running for office, and so that candidates can wage more competitive campaigns. Also encouraging voters and in the city to engage more meaningfully with candidates is another goal. By allowing their contributions to be matched with limited public funding, it helps leverage and increase the value of those smaller contributions to candidates. And of course, importantly, reducing real or perceived corruption that can come or be attributed to contributions that come from individuals, private contributions, and in exchange, or instead, having a source of funds that really is tied only to the public or the taxpayers' more neutral interests, if you will. So, as you've heard discussed in the previous phases of our campaign finance program review, we have been looking at the program on a number of fronts to try and assess its effectiveness and strengthen its effectiveness going forward. As you know, the public financing program is a voluntary program for candidates, so it needs to be attractive to candidates for them to participate. And assessing that, ensuring that it's current and attractive can be tricky. The city laws have changed in this area frequently over the years since the program was first established in 2000. The good news there is that that's been an endeavor to keep the program effective and relevant to the changing dynamics of campaigns. It can make empirical data a bit tricky to assess because some of the program parameters have changed over time. But it is very important to us to bring forward to you the best information we have that is based on current data and try to assess from that data what it tells us about and suggests about improvements that could be made. With the eye towards being as objective and clear-eyed as possible, we really want to try and see what are the dynamics that are at play in most recent elections, question and assess whether there are provisions that have outlived their usefulness, even if they may have been helpful at one point. And really, this is, I think, a tune-up. It's not really an overhaul. But we wanted to bring forward our recommendations substantively so that today at this meeting, although no action is required of the Commission, we wanted to bring the recommendations forward, get a sense from you of the kinds of provisions that you might want to see at the next meeting, more formalized and written out for discussion. We wanted to try and elicit as much public comment today if there are individuals who'd like to do that at this meeting. And we look forward to bringing next month to you a package that helps strengthen the system so that we can really have better participation rates as one goal, more candidates participating, more voters engaging, and really a stronger program that more deeply uses available funds that voters in San Francisco have set aside specifically for this purpose. How we have approached this process, you'll remember, phase one was to look at administrative changes coming out of the 2018 election. So that phase one looked at administrative features of the program. It resulted in approved regulations, a review of the administration of qualification and matching funds claims, also improved guidance material, what we learned from this last election to help improve information for candidates and those who are supporting candidates, internal administrative changes to strengthen the program administration going forward, and also an ordinance that the Commission has passed and is at the Rules Committee at the Board of Supervisors presently. And just as a quick update on that, we did hear just today that It looks like the ordinance will be scheduled as, maybe in the coming week or so. We had first thought it was going to be May 6th. We've now heard that it's going to be moved up to a sooner time frame, so that's encouraging news, I think. This second phase 2, again, this is one that really is looking at the more substantive features of the program. Item 4 before you is a report, a comprehensive report that our policy team, supported by our information systems team, put together, assessing information and data and research from other agencies to see what kind of leading practices are out there and how agencies are dealing with emerging issues in the public financing arena. So we have initial findings and recommendations detailed in the memo. We based that work on a variety of pieces, including interviews with candidates and treasurers, consultants. Again, the program needs to be relevant and attractive to candidates. That was one piece of information. That's not the only basis for the recommendations we have here. We also did interested persons meetings on March 4th and the 8th, and looked at a deep analysis of the campaign finance data, and as I mentioned, a review of other jurisdictions. I just wanted to provide that context and background again for where we are and how we got here today. And as you'll see the report, it provides an overview of the program and then walks through the methodology and specific findings and recommendations. And we have at the very end of the report, which I think I just will walk through briefly and then open it to questions or further discussion in more detailed way as you'd prefer. On page, it's agenda item 4, page 18. There is a list of all legislative recommendations that are contained here. I will note as well that there is an attachment that we received comment from the Campaign Legal Center that provided some observations and some additional recommendations, which I think are compelling and well worth looking at and discussing. But they provided some information as well as a report about campaign financing and public financing at jurisdictions around the country, which I think Brian can speak to more if you have some questions about. But in terms of the list of legislative recommendations, they are listed on page 18. The first is to look at public funding and how which of the contributions will be matched for purposes of public funding. We are recommending in this report that public funding be available for the first $100 from any contributor. Currently, it's the first $500, or the full maximum that a contributor can give. And we're proposing to match it at a 6-to-1 ratio. You may recall that the current program has a tiered approach after a candidate receives an initial grant. They then can submit claims for matching funds, and those are matched first at a a 2-for-1 rate, and then moves on to a tiered, a next tier of dollar for dollar. We're proposing to simply have a 6-to-1 match when they start submitting claims. The other piece, and number 2, is when candidates initially qualify and are certified as eligible, they currently receive an initial grant that helps them with their campaign based on their qualification for public financing. That grant we are proposing to increase from $10,000, we should just turn the microphone over to Brian right now. We're proposing to increase it from $20,000 for supervisorial candidates to $60,000, and from $100,000 in the mayoral race to $300,000. So we're looking at increasing the grant at the initial stage. One of the things that programs have tried to do is to give candidates as the resources that they've qualified to receive relatively earlier in a campaign, and being able to increase the match is responsive to the goal of having candidates have that, qualified candidates have a bit more resources sooner than is currently the case by increasing that initial grant. We also have a proposal to increase the maximum funding that a candidate can receive. There are 2 alternatives we've identified. One is alternative 1, which raises the levels to an amount that based on current examples and patterns of fundraising. We looked at if those patterns were to continue, how much might we be able to increase the overall amount of candidates can receive and still be within the existing election campaign fund parameters. And so those levels are shown under alternative 1. That would be increasing the maximum for a supervisorial candidate to $210,000 and to $1.2 million for a mayoral candidate that qualifies. The second alternative is a slightly higher amount of money that would be provided. That, however, has some implications, again, assuming patterns of fundraising and the assumptions that we made about the number of candidates, that could potentially tax the election campaign fund in a way that would require additional funds to be allocated to that election campaign fund. So that's a consideration. It's a more generous program in the sense that it helps get candidates more resources, but there's the alternative that it also implicates the potential for greater election campaign funds. How would that allocation happen? Would it be timely? Is it workable? So those are a couple of issues to think about as you discuss that. I'm going to let Brian perhaps talk in more detail about number 4 when we get to it, but this would be amending the appropriation language that would make essentially provide a greater sustainability for the program funding as it currently exists. The next is to increase the initial individual expenditure ceiling to $350,000 for supervisorial candidates and to $1.7 million for mayoral candidates. In recent meetings, you've heard discussion about the extent that candidates have to limit their initial spending as an exchange for receiving public funds. And is there a need at this point in time, given the amount of fundraising and spending we've seen by candidates in recent elections, to elevate the initial spending limit to which candidates agree? This would provide a higher spending limit for candidates at the outset of their participation. And then we also looked at the question of whether there is a way to make the public funds available earlier to candidates than is currently the case. And we have a proposal here that would retain the existing time frame that says public funds can't be provided to candidates until the 142nd day before the election. That is the earliest date on which matching funds can be provided currently. Public funds can be provided currently. We're taking a slightly different approach that would continue that practice with regard to matching funds, but that we would propose allowing the grant to be distributed to a qualified candidate sooner, so that the candidate could receive their grant amount earlier in the election cycle and have sort of seed money, if you will, based on their eligibility and qualification that would be determined at that point in time. But then they would have to wait until the 142nd day to actually have matching funds distributed. So we're trying to explore, again, is there a way to provide resources a bit earlier to candidates in their campaigns so that it becomes more meaningful and encourages competition? And then the last is something that came up as an issue, a fairly minor one, but it has significance. The qualification fundraising period that is articulated in the current law is confusing. It's different as to mayoral candidates and as to supervisorial candidates. One uses language we're harmonizing the way those two provisions work. We're not really changing it substantively, but we're making it clear that it is by the 70th day before the election that candidates must submit their qualifying papers. The language was inconsistent for mayoral and supervisorial candidates. I think I will stop there just to see if there are any clarifying comments or questions. Or Brian, if there is anything that you want to add that maybe clarifies some of the approaches that we've taken, I'll turn over to you.
Just briefly, good afternoon, Commissioners. I just want to make some clarifying comments with respect to what Director Pelham said in looking at the recommendation number 4 to amend the election campaign fund appropriation language. So the issue that we might run up against...
Mr. Cox, could you speak closer to the microphone, please? Thank you.
Is that better? I'm
yes,
sorry.
Much better. Thank you.
It's the first time at the mic, so... So on page 15 of the report, we note that in Table 8, this is the distribution to all publicly financed candidates in 2018, and this is kind of a comprehensive view of what the campaigns cost over the election cycle. And as you can see, if you look at the cost over one election campaign cycle, the total cost is $9.75 million. So just doing some back-of-the-envelope math really quickly, if we get an annual appropriation of $2.42 million, that's going to be about $9.7 million. So this projection sort of indicates that we're going to be a little bit short, right? And that's using the higher value of $270,000 for the Board of Supervisors and $1.5 million for the mayor mayoral race. So that would be alternative 2 under the proposal. So there are just some concern that we might the fund might over time be depleted. There is a remedy, of course. So we could ask the Board of Supervisors for additional funding if that were to happen. That's not guaranteed, but there are provisions in the code that allow us to do exactly that. We do recommend, so on the next page, page 16, that Commission approve new language, making that additional appropriation part of the fund guaranteed, right? So instead of it being optional, it being fully guaranteed. That way, at least it's a signal that we want to make sure that the program has enough funding and that it doesn't run. There is no shortfall. So the goal of that is just to effectively make sure that we never run out of money for the programs. We can never exhaust the fund. But so given the current projections, at least for alternative number 2, that could be a possibility.
So, Mr. Cox, just to clarify, for alternative number 2, how much would the shortfall be from the appropriated amount to the projected cost of over one election cycle of the 9.75 million, roughly 9.751 million?
Sure. So the appropriation over the election cycle would be about $9.7 million.
Okay, so it would be about a 50,000 and change.
Yes,
shortfall.
That's based on the estimates that we have so far. That's looking backward. We can't say what it would be looking forward, of course.
And then do you know, off the top of your head, at what percentage of utilization of the election fund that we have tapped into over time? Is it? I know we haven't ever exhausted it in any given election cycle, but historically, is it 80%, 40%?
That's a very good question. I don't think we've done that level of analysis. We certainly can. I know there has been a surplus historically, but I think as the program ramps up and as we sort of change the model to distribute potentially more funds, looking back historically might not be the best marker, right? But still, we can certainly look into that.
And then because this is one of the this is a very big financial lever in the program overall, and so there. Under the 2 scenarios, there could potentially be a $50,000 shortfall from what we're projecting to what the new maximums would be. And we could propose language that would make the appropriation guaranteed as opposed to optional. Have we thought about looking at the appropriation per resident amount to begin with? I believe that was $275 per resident, and that was set in 2008 or 11.
I believe that was, yeah.
I think it was 2008. And so if we look at inflation, $275 is probably closer to $4 now. I ran an online calculator the other day, and I think it was about $4.25. Right. So have we thought about that, or could you look into that? It's like if we tweaked the appropriation amount, so instead of keeping it at $275 per resident, if the overall fund were larger because we're appropriating $3 or $3.50 or $4, like how much would that increase the funds? And could that solve the problem and still leave us within the with enough room to fund at higher rates?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's something we can definitely look into. I'm not sure the mechanics on that right now, but I think that's something definitely.
Yeah, and that's why I would want to understand at what rate have we exhausted, like what rate of the current fund do we have, because it's not a great case to say we've only ever used 50% or 60%, and then we're asking for more.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you. I don't know if, Commissioners, do you have any other questions, or if there's more staff presentation on these?
If I could just ask a
Of
follow-up
course.
question regarding the rollover, because apparently every cycle there's some unused money. So for the $9.7 million currently in the fund, does it include all the rollovers that we have?
There's a maximum that is in the fund at any given time, and if we're at that maximum, the rollover sort of caps, right?
Okay.
And the additional funding doesn't exceed the maximum. Okay. So I think the maximum is around $7 million currently. I think that number is fairly accurate. So any additional funding wouldn't top that.
Commissioner Ambrose?
If I may, I don't know if you know the answer, but I'm curious what the ordinance provides if you were to exceed the appropriation. So without changing the law, what would be the default
That's a great question, Commissioner Ambrose. The Section 1.154 allows the Commission to request additional funding from the Board of Supervisors. It's a discretionary call. They don't have to do it, but it's something that we can ask them to do. So the mechanism.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my question is, though, so if we have an understanding or agreement, that's what I'm trying to understand, with the respective campaigns that are anticipating funding based on the terms of the ordinance, and we run out of money, do we just divide the difference and everybody just gets a little bit less? Or, because of course the board has discretion whether or not to appropriate more funds. So
Yeah.
I'm just curious what the expectation would be to the campaigns. I don't know if there's language in the ordinance that just says, to the extent that funds are available, we'll give you this much money, or so on.
Right. I think that's something that staff has discussed as in terms of protocols, like what would happen in that case.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that we have exactly a clear answer at this point. And yeah, sure.
My understanding is that I'm not sure what year it was, until 2012. There had been a provision that provided for some percentage holdback, I think, across the board for candidates, if there was apparently not enough funding to accommodate the draw on all candidates that were participating. So I think that's something that we could look at here of, if whatever level of funding is desired, it could be useful to go back to adding language that says anytime there is a number of candidates participating, that the maximum draw could potentially exceed the balance of the fund for that election, that at some point during the election there will be a predictable and understood and transparent process by which the executive director of the commission or the commission assesses, will there be a sufficient balance in the fund to accommodate all, and if not, to the maximum. And if not, then from this point forward we'll take it and say it's 60% of the maximum would be available, or something like that. There are provisions like that in other jurisdictions, so it might make sense to look at inserting that into this discussion next month as well, if I'm understanding your question correctly.
Yeah, I think we all understand that we can engage in deficit spending, so I'm just curious what the default is. But so there should be some proviso for that, even though it hasn't happened in the past, especially if we're going to push the limit. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think it's important for us to have a mechanism in the event, whether or not the amounts are changed, that we have the ability to assess how much is in the fund, because it does function as an arms race, right? Whoever gets to the finish line first, if they can tap out, because there's a fixed amount of money in the public financing bank account. But to have a mechanism in place to be able to determine what a pro rata distribution would look like when the funds are going to be insufficient to cover everyone to the maximum, and in particular if we raise the maximum, but even if we don't, go beyond if we go with option 2.
If I may, I have one more question. I think I read somewhere in the staff report that Supervisor Marr has continued to discuss but has not yet introduced ordinance language addressing the public financing issues that we previously discussed and the ones that are being put forward here. Do we have any further information about that, or is his office participating in any of the community outreach that you've and your staff have engaged in? I'm just wondering, if we're trying to stay on the same page or get feedback from them.
I'm not aware that the separate public financing package that Supervisor Marr had thought about introducing what has been introduced. He's moving on the package that the commission sent over as sponsor of that. And
Okay.
That's the one that I mentioned earlier would be likely to be scheduled sooner than May 6th. Originally it was May 6th. But that's, I think, the separate.
So it would be that would be addressed in a separate ordinance. These issues are not.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. And as to public outreach that's been ongoing, I'm not familiar with what Supervisor Marr's office might have been doing. Our office has been in touch with his staff during this process to gather input, but I'm not aware myself of activities that his office might be engaged in otherwise.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
questions?
I would add, Commissioner Ambrose, that his office is working with BLA to conduct a review of like the potential financial impacts of some of the changes that we're looking at. I think the proposals they're looking at are somewhat similar, and so they're doing an analysis right now that I'm not sure when it's supposed to be completed, but they would figure out the impact of how much that would cost over time. But I think that's
I'm sorry,
forthcoming.
who did you say is doing the analysis?
So BLA. sorry.
BLA.
Budget and legislative analysts, excuse me.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Would it be possible for the commissioners and commission staff to receive a copy of that report once it's available?
Absolutely.
I'd be very interested to see what their analysis comes up with in terms of the spend, if they're using numbers similar to what we've proposed here.
Yes, of course.
Great. So I have a few questions, both raised in the with regard to the recommendations as well as in the public comment submitted by the Campaign Legal Center. And so one is regarding the $100 amount for the initial contribution that would be matched and the ratio. So there was some public comment that I received from the other day expressing concern about $100 and was looking more to $200. I don't know, Mr. Cox, if you could talk us through a little bit how you came to recommend the $100. I think that would
Sure.
be helpful, as well as the 6-to-1 ratio.
Sure. So before we arrived at the $100 mark for matching purposes, we decided to do some outreach to candidates and their treasurers and their staff to get a sense of what are the real purposes of the program and what are we trying to really do here? And I think that in talking with the staff or talking with the candidates and their staff, we got a real sense that they were interested in empowering sort of small contributions. And many of them said that it's really difficult for their constituents and their supporters to give $500. That's a theme we heard over and over and over again, and even 400 or 300, and that there was a significant, emphasis that they put on. We really want more people to participate, and I think that's one of the goals that we have in this program as well, is to get more voters involved. I think all the research suggests that if you have residents who contribute to campaigns, they're more likely to vote, and I think that's one goal that we're trying to really emphasize here with this. So we started with that premise of, what are we hearing from the candidates? And that's kind of universally what they were saying, is that, this $100, I know that a lot of talk out there is, for $200. And I think within that range somewhere is, I'm not sure if one necessarily mathematically is better than the other. But what we've heard is that a lot of, contributors do put in that $100. And I think our idea was to really empower that as much as we could. And so that was the premise of the starting point of that. And then we looked at how that would change as compared to a maximum contribution of $500. And I think chart
3 on page 7.
That's probably correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Illustrates that distinction. As you can see, a $500 contribution nets you $1,500 total from the program. And we felt that, and in talking with candidates and sort of doing some thinking about the issue, is that it's really difficult for someone who has just $100 to feel like their voice can be heard, that they can make an impact, and that might be keeping some contributors away from the table. And so lowering it to that amount we felt was appropriate to sort of support those smaller contributors. So that was the thinking behind the $100 matchable amount. And then as far as the 6-to-1, I think that there's a general community trend in the public finance arena to provide higher match amount. And I know that New York, they have had a 6-to-1. Now they're moving closer to an 8-to-1. I know Los Angeles, they have that in Portland. And so there's a lot of, I think that's where the cutting edge seems to be going. And we looked at how that would shift the balance, not the balance, but how that would further empower those smaller grassroots contributors, and that impact is substantial at a 6-to-1. So we felt that would be appropriate to really support those.
Yeah, so I did a little bit of internet research on my own, and 6-to-1 that we've proposed and $100, I think is within the ballpark of what's currently, as you said, cutting edge. Berkeley is 6-to-1 at $50. New York is 8-to-1, $250 for mayor and $175 for their city council members. They also have other public races, but I just sticking to mayor and the equivalent of the Board of Supervisors. LA just went to, has been at 6-to-1, but they reduced the amount. Mayor is 214, and Board of Supervisors equivalent would be 114.
114, yeah.
And Denver is 9-to-1 at $50. That's not going to go into effect, I think, until 2021. And Portland is 6-to-1 at $50. So I think that $100 seems to be the right amount. And I see we've got members of the public who could comment. I'd really like to hear from them as well. And then I think that the impact that you note here in Chart 3 is significant, and obviously $500 is 5 times more than $100. But when you look at the 6-to-1 matching, the impact of that would be significant if you're counting $500, and even at $200, it's not on here, but a $100 contribution would be $700, right? Because you are matching at 6-to-1. A $200 contribution, though, because it's $200, is going to be multiplied by 6, so that's $1,200, and so the impact of that is $1,400, which is doubled. And then for a $500 contribution, it's $1,700, because the 200 is then multiplied by 6, and you have $1,700. So I think that there's a big difference in terms of impact of 6-to-1 at 100 or 6-to-1 at 200, and that the 200 mark is it kind of disproportionately favors the larger donation. The larger donation, the bigger the impact, and would and if you look then back on Chart 2, the number of people who can contribute $100 to $199 is only 8%.
That's a great point.
And whereas 73% are contributing from 400 to 500.
Yeah.
And so those smaller donors are making smaller contributions, and their impact is going to be, is already small from a percentage of the overall contribution chart, but with a larger $200 amount, the impact of the $100 is still going to be diminished.
Exactly. And that was one of the motivations for New York to alter their system, is that they found kind of this specific issue that the maximum donors have a disproportionate impact on the campaign financing, and so they wanted to sort of rework that to really boost the contributions at the lower end. And so, in looking at this distribution, we found very similar things.
Yeah. And in Chicago, just in the Chicago mayor's race in 2018, the top 8 fundraising candidates, only 1.4% gave at $150 or less. So again, it's a pretty similar scenario. Okay, so bear with me. I have a few more questions. So in terms of we talked about the funding cap. I mean, I like the idea of having more money, but I think from a policy standpoint, what do we as a commission feel is responsible? If we were to support 270, alternative 2, 270, and 1.5, but that goes beyond the 4-year election cycle appropriation. It's shortfall of 50,000. How do we feel about that? I think putting more money into public financing, I think, is a good thing. Clean money versus dark money is always better. And then I had a question about the initial spending limits. Currently, it's $250 for the Board of Supervisors and $1.475 for the mayor. And the proposal is to raise it to $350 for supervisorial races and $1.7 for the mayor's race. So that looks like a 40% increase, and it's pretty in line with the amount of money that's being spent in kind of the average race amounts on page 11, table 4. But the mayoral race is the cumulative average over 3 races is 1.9, and 1.7 seems, that's a 15% increase over the 1.475. Can you walk us through a little bit of your thinking and how you got to the 1.7 as opposed to, 1.8 or 1.9?
So I think it was just a simple calculation of a factor of 6, right? Because we're matching at a ratio of 6. And I think that was a number that we looked at, and that's one factor. And then secondly, looking at how much candidates have spent, over time, we felt that number was appropriate, given the money that it takes to run a competitive campaign. That is a substantial increase over what candidates have received, and it's an increase over what they have spent. But after getting feedback from stakeholders and candidates, we thought that number was appropriate, given what they felt they would need to spend to be successful in those races.
Okay. And then the second is we received some public comment, very concerned about moving the date forward or backward, however you want to think about it, for the receipt of the initial grant. Everything used to be triggered off of the 142nd day, and then now the proposal is to split the initial grant and put that out at the earliest eligible date would be the 284th day, and there was the concern about zombie candidates. Sure. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, where people would file to run for office and collect public money, but then once they see who all else entered the field, they would then suspend their campaign or not, but would have received public funds, and then we could not get them. They wouldn't complete the race.
Yes, I take the criticism and concerns quite seriously. I think in speaking with candidates, we reached almost the opposite conclusion. They felt that, if I had the money sooner, I could get my ground game going. I could put some staff in place. I could get my name out there. And I think that in talking with the candidates, every race has its own idiosyncrasies. Some candidates prefer to get their names out there early. Others prefer to wait until September. I think what we're trying to do is give candidates who are viable, right, who have that demonstrated grassroots support, the opportunity and platform to run the campaign as they see fit. And I think that we've heard, from some of them, yeah, if I had the money in January for a November election, yeah, that'd have been great. And we're not talking about giving them access to matching funds. This is just the initial grant, right? And so the concern of zombie candidates certainly is real. But I think that given the dynamics of the folks we've talked to in the race, that their perspective has been this would help us. I think reach out, get our name out there, because that's I think sometimes a big issue for grassroots candidates, that getting the name out there might be challenging to do so at the very last moment, because they're waiting on public funding is a big hurdle for them.
I think that one of our previous public commenters, Mr. Gollinger, had said that early money's like yeast, right? And so that everything can rise from and after that. Okay, then, so I would like to think about that a little bit more, because I would want to balance to make sure that candidates are getting the benefit of money in a timely way, in an early way, which would be helpful, but also to not resurrect some of the problems that the current regulatory regime was trying to address, and to eliminate these zombie candidates. It sounds so horror film-esque. And then I wanted to turn to a couple issues that were raised in the public comment from CLC, and one was a residency requirement. They said that if for candidates running for a specific district, should some qualifying contributions, a certain percentage of them be from the residents of the district that they're seeking to represent. On the one hand, I think that it makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, it's an additional hurdle. Yeah, no, that's a great point. When we read that, we took that very seriously. I think that Los Angeles currently employs a model that looks like that. You have to get a certain percentage of your contributions from your district when you run for city council. I think there are administrative hurdles there that might sort of militate against that idea, specifically figuring out where someone lives, they live in the right area, and then kind of verifying that. I think candidates, universally have expressed the idea that it's really difficult to qualify for some of the reasons that we're addressing in phase one. Right.
And with verifying addresses and verifying locations.
Is it in District 1? Is it in District 4?
Exactly. I was talking with a treasurer a few days ago and said, we had to chase this guy down 4 or 5 times, and it just took so many hours to do it. 3 or 4 campaign staff for one check. And I think that's something that if we have this residency requirement, it adds another hurdle. And there are clearly, there are clear public policy benefits to doing so, to make sure that you have demonstrated community support, and that's certainly valid. But we have to balance that against what compliance cost this is going to place on candidates, and whether that's going to push them out of the race. And so I think we want to make the running for office not as easy as possible necessarily, but certainly not unnecessarily difficult. But that's something we're certainly open to evaluating. We just felt at this time, in terms of changing the structure, we're focused more on the matchable amount, and tinkering with that aspect of it, rather than making it more difficult or easier to qualify for the program.
I think from a policy standpoint, it makes sense to tie the candidate back to the district, but it does impose, I think, a pretty significant regulatory burden in terms of proving that residency. I think it's challenging enough, as we heard from the many hearings that we had last year, on how onerous the process could feel through a lot of the time. Okay, I have one last question, and that is regard to the requirement for there to be an opposition candidate, and what the CLC was recommending was that there shouldn't need to be an opposition candidate. If someone's running unopposed, why wouldn't they be entitled to access public funds for the campaign? Because clean money is always better than not clean. Public money is always better than not public money. So, certainly, and I think that that idea is really attractive to make campaigns as clean as possible. I think, again, our focus this time around was not necessarily on changing the qualifications of the process, but rather just on the mechanics of it. I know that certainly we can look at that as an idea. I would note, though, that because we have budgetary constraints, that's something that to focus on as well, is like how, if we have candidates who are running either unopposed or against candidates who don't qualify for public financing, how do we model that into our numbers to make sure that we are being responsible to the fund itself. But again, it's something we can certainly look at. But I think that was maybe outside of the scope of what we were focused on, I think, this time around, for just this specific round of regulations and proposals. Okay. If you could come back, with Pat next month with a recommendation, if not necessarily from a modeling, from a financial standpoint, but just from a policy standpoint about eliminating that requirement, I'd be interested to hear, and also interested to hear from from the public about that, eliminating that requirement. Okay, I think those are all the questions that I had. I didn't want to hog all the time, but anything else from Commissioner Lee?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for the really informative report and recommendations. I just have a couple of questions or comments. The first one's regarding the $100 starting point. I don't know if you have any data from the San Francisco campaigns, but anecdotally, I've been hearing from other campaigns across the country that grassroots candidates, first-time candidates, folks who really want to get involved, who have community ties, really rely on $100 or less donors to get them started. So it would be great if you can find some San Francisco data to show that, because I do think that if we're going to talk about clean government, encouraging folks to get involved with the process, we really need to bring the invisible folks to the campaigns. The second thing is the chair mentioned about the campaign legal center's recommendation about residency. I think on the policy standpoint and on paper, it really sounds good, because you should represent the the people who voted you in. But San Francisco is a little bit unique from the other jurisdictions that they had mentioned because we are facing a gentrification problem here in the city. And looking at specifically the Asian Pacific American community, some of the districts where we have a sizable Asian populations do not have Asian Americans elected to represent them, but they have other district representatives who understand their needs and concerns, and they may not be from the district, but they certainly understand the Asian Pacific American community's broader needs, and they have very often served not as a de facto supervisor for them, but definitely a responsible political leader to really represent their voice. So I think that for the residency requirement, I think that it would be good not to just look at other best practices, but look at San Francisco's unique situation because, we are very diverse population. But if you look at, some of the especially politically underrepresented populations, this may be the residency requirement may be more hurtful to some of those communities. So I would like you to take a look at that. And I'm a great not supporting it, but I'm very interested in the Seattle democracy voucher program. And I have friends there who just swear by it. They just love it. And I know that it's not included in the staff recommendation, but I'm glad that you are going to continue to monitor this program. And I know that when it got first rolled out, there were some kinks here and there, but they are going to have the second round at it in June. And I would recommend that because I know that many of them who started from way back when to work on the legislation and now still working on the community outreach, they would love to share their perspectives after June. And I would recommend that maybe we could invite them, not at least to participate via phone, to talk to us, to share with us what happened in June, because there was some concern about the public awareness and the outreach and everything else, but they are going to work on it for the June one, and I'm really eager to hear how they work on it, because I think ultimately, for me, the goal is direct control of public finance by the voters, and I think that is such an innovative program that I would love for us to continue to monitor and to learn from them. Maybe there could be a hybrid version for San Francisco. So maybe for the June or August meeting, we can invite them either to participate in the interested persons meeting that we have, or if we have the technology, have them call in. And I know a few of them, they would love to use their own money, they said, come down here to visit San Francisco, and while they're here,
they can fly us
share
up.
the experience. So I hope that we will continue to leave the Seattle voucher program on our front burner, so that we do not forget, because I think the principle of the voter, the resident controlling their political destiny is really something that I like us to really explore.
Right, and I think that now that policy staff is at full capacity, that's one thing that we're actively doing, is to trying to monitor what the best practices are from our other partners around the country. And certainly we've been in touch with Los Angeles and New York, and I think working closely with the people in our backyard here, and as well as Seattle is on our priority list. So absolutely.
One thing that I would be very interested to know, echo Commissioner Lee's comments, the concern I have about the voucher model is the high cost of administration. So according to a Common Cause report in August of 2018, the administrative cost to administer the program was $1,036,600. And the amount of funds that were distributed, the vouchers, was $1,140,525. So for every dollar of public funds that were utilized, it cost 91 cents to administer, which is not great.
Yeah.
And I think, first year, second year, there'll be a lot of learnings for that. But, I would want to watch this model mature and, better understand, how can they become more effective in, reducing their administrative cost and, making sure that of the $2 million that you're spending more than 52% on the actual funds that get distributed to candidates. And, how are they going to solve that challenge? Because if we have $9.7 million, I would hate to see $5 million of it go to administrative cost.
Certainly, and I think that's something we've observed and heard as well about the Seattle program, is that it's groundbreaking, but at the same time there are these administrative issues that might be they have to overcome those problems, and we're monitoring that, of course, and after the June election we'll definitely see where we are that way. I mean,
I would love to see in the fullness of time. Because right now all of our citywide races that receive public funding only from mayor and board of supervisor, but what about city DA or city attorney or school board, and could we do a pilot of something, down the road when there's a little more information, a little more maturity in the actual program. Yeah. So definitely keep an eye on that.
Absolutely.
Any other comments or questions before public comment? All right, would like to call for public comment now on this agenda item.
Good afternoon. John Gollinger. Hello. Speaking for myself, was pleased to read the report and appreciate the staff's good work on this. I know the Board of Supervisors is looking at the issue too. My understanding from talking to folks there is they're waiting to see what comes of this meeting today. I think the intent, as is understood, is to move something forward in the next month or two, not to wait longer. So I do hope this keeps moving. Let me comment on the proposal, and I'm sure I'll run out of time. So if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer. I wanted to touch on 4 areas. First and most important, 100% excited that the commission, staff and commissioners who spoke seem very bought in on the notion of both raising the matching ratio and lowering the amount that's matchable for all the reasons discussed. I think empowering small donors, and my experience as an advocate and as a campaign manager, speaks to what was said, that regular people, quote unquote, can give 100, 200, 300 maybe, but 500 is a stretch. The 6-to-1, I think, is at least New York voters just voted for 8-to-1. So I would encourage the commission to consider even a higher rate, but 6-to-1 for sure. I think 100 is too low, and not for the reason of empowering small donors, because I agree the lower you go, the more you empower people who can give $10, and that's a real thing. But for the purpose of the other problem with the program is that, to my knowledge, it has never been the case where candidates have maxed out on the amount of public funds they could get and actually using it. And so I see your review and your proposals to not just empower the donor side, but help candidates who want to use this program to run on a clean money program to actually get the money they're entitled to. And I just did my back of the envelope of the chart on page 7, but you're actually lowering the amount of money available to public financing candidates with that proposal. And I'm going to run out of time before I get to any other things, so I hope you ask me about the others. But
so why don't you do the 3 minutes, and then I'm sure we'll have follow-up questions, and after public comment is over, we'll ask you to come back.
Okay.
And then
let me just follow through on this one thought then,
Yep.
and I want to touch on some other points if I get a chance. But for example, by lowering the matchable donation to $100, you allow, I've given $500, I don't have a lot of money, but I've given $500 to people I support. My $500 under the current program is worth $1,500 to a public finance candidate. Under your new program, it's worth $1,100. So if you think of a candidate who's running against a non-publicly financed candidate, you've just made it harder for them to actually take advantage of the program. And that, I understand I would consider that a different purpose of these reforms than empowering small donors, and 100% agree lowering it. 200 is the number I would encourage. New York's is 175. I think 100 is a bit too low, and I think there'll be more debate on that. So
Okay.
should I leave it at that and come back? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
My name is Esther Mars, and I was a volunteer treasurer for a Board of Supervisor publicly financed campaign in 2016 and 2018. And I do appreciate the staff recommendations regarding the public finance program. I thought the report was thoughtful, and the findings were supported the recommendations. And I am open to the 200, but at this anyway, I think the initial grant of public financing and the higher ratio matching funds of 61 up to 100 would give qualified candidates the resources to run a competitive campaign. The awarding of the initial grant to an earlier date also helps campaigns set up a solid foundation to build on. It would allow campaigns to focus on broader-based support and ultimately give the public greater confidence in the election process. However, from my perspective, if the initial expenditure limit is increased to $350,000 for Board of Supervisors and $1.7 million for mayor's race, I would recommend the maximum of public funds received by a candidate be increased accordingly. In other words, $255,000 for our Board of Supervisors campaign, $1.475 million for a mayoral campaign. An increase in initial expenditure limit is advantageous to campaigns that have large institutional support and disadvantage to a more grassroots campaign. It's easier for a campaign that receives many $500 contributions to make up the funds that are not matched by public funds.
Thank you. Any other public comment? No. Okay. Yeah, so Mr. Gollinger, I wanted to call you back. Yeah, not public comment, but just,
Edward Wright, Supervisor Marr's office, is on his way, and he would like.
oh, he is. Okay. Commissioners, do you have any questions for Mr. Gollinger or Ms. Marks?
I did actually, because I don't believe that we heard your views on moving the contribution availability, the grant availability up into the 284th day
Yes.
versus the 142nd.
Thank you. That was one of the points. I'd raised this myself earlier, and one of the other points I did want to touch on. I think, for the reasons that are laid out in the staff proposal, I think it's a good idea to make available at least the initial grant. I would argue to make available the matching funds, in my experience, that the more, it's both to make grassroots campaigns more viable and effective, the ability to hire a person or people to go knock on doors or to organize town hall meetings, to be able to do that with enough of a window that you're not in the heat of the campaign when you're just bringing someone on board makes a huge difference. And I think that's what the candidates who are going to really care about the time difference between getting the 60,000 or what have you in the summer and at the beginning of the year, it will make a huge difference to them. I also think, I was talking about this earlier with someone, that the current makeup of the program means you get the money at earliest in the summer when most regular people are not paying attention to politics. And so to the extent you're going to do organizing and sort of the grassroots work we want more of, you largely have to wait and to begin that until the fall. If you could take advantage of the program even through just the grant earlier in the year, January, you could get that ball rolling. You could do smaller, more sort of substantive meetings and conversations throughout the spring, and then give people a break for the summer while you get your campaign together. The last thing I would say is I actually think, I know the Ethics Commission's needs are not the number one reason you're fixing the program, but I actually think the current program means everyone comes to you, to the commission staff at once to get the money. So there's a glut and I think an inefficiency of that management. Whereas if you give a longer window of time to apply, you'll incentivize candidates to apply for the program, qualify over a longer stretch of time, and sort of spread that out so that candidates from their end and your end can have done that admin outside of the hectic time of the campaign. So I think, I mean, you know, there's not always like the last couple examples. People have talked about last year's mayor's race, which was a snap election, was what, 5-month race, and the District 4 race last year, which Ms. Marks was involved in, was also basically a 5-month race. Those are unusual. There are more than one unusual campaign in San Francisco politics, but the more common ones, District 5, the race we're seeing there, it's a year plus is more typically how long these races are. And so the current system, I do think, deprives publicly financed candidates of public funds for most of that time. And by giving them at least a chunk of that money sooner, I think you'll strengthen the program.
So, Mr. Gollinger,
yeah.
just to make sure I understand, so the more typical timeframe of a race would, if it's a November election, when would that organizing and the work begin?
Well, in 2019, San Francisco, in the hot races, I mean, a year to a year and a half, honestly. I mean, at least the initial work. So I think, you know, the District 6 race last year was a more typical example because that was a termed-out supervisor. Everyone knew was open. One or more people were clearly going to run. And so I know at least one candidate, and I think more than one, began a year and a half out to get going. You know, that's a little, not all candidates have it together that much, but I think both the appointed incumbent in District 5 and her main challenger started over a year and something. And so doing this work, to me, in my sort of mentally, in January, February, getting your public finance qualification done, getting that chunk, and only have to worrying about the matching part of it would make a big difference and give them a chunk of money to work from.
And do you have a point of view on the amount of the initial grant that was
increased? Yeah, the amount, well, I think...
I mean, obviously more is always better, but, you know.
I think the proposal is to increase it. I think the proposal, is to increase it to 60 for...
60 and 300?
I think that's right. I think that's the right ballpark. I wanted to say, I agree with Ms. Marks' comment. It was one of the other things I wanted to raise, that I do think the overall amount available needs to track, for supervisor race in particular, needs to track the increase in the overall spending limit. That currently, with a $250,000 supervisor limit and $155,000 available public money, there's about a $100,000 delta. And if you're raising the spending limit to $350,000, I think you should keep that $100,000, because basically that's, you know, the private money someone has to raise. And if you raise the spending limit and aren't doing that, you're basically disproportionately hurting the program. I think that's what Ms. Marks said. So that's the one change I would make to that proposal, would be to up, sort of in between your alternative A, or 1 and 2, would be 250 instead of 210 or 270, right, basically right in the middle. I think that would resolve that. And then I wanted to also comment on, as I think Commissioner Lee raised, the CLC recommendations. The one I found, I think, easily doable, and I think our program only prohibited candidates who didn't have an opponent from getting public money when it was originally formed, under the assumption that they wanted to limit possible expenditures that would make the program look bad. And I think there was, I'm sure, a fear at the time that people would abuse the program. Our experience to date has been the opposite, that not enough people are using this program. And I do think, as CLC suggested, eliminating that requirement, that just because you don't have an opponent or a serious, quote-unquote, opponent, you have to then rely on on private special interest money. And in fact, we want our incumbents, which is who those people usually will be, to not have to over-rely on outside special interest money. I would prefer they use the public's money and they spend it wisely, and if they don't, they'll be held accountable, I'm sure. So I agree with that. The residency, I think, is interesting. I mean, philosophically, I agree with it. I actually think if you tweak the matchable amount and the ratio properly, you're getting the same impact, because the CLC report pointed out in New York, they've shown that by lowering the matchable amount to 175 and raising the ratio, that tends to really get more candidates to talk to more donors in their district, because those are the very people who will give them, that's where they can find more people who will give them $100 or $200. So I think you accomplish that the same way, but I mean, I'm not totally opposed to that requirement. I just think you can accomplish it without imposing that additional burden. Those are my other comments. Did you have any other questions for me?
Commissioner
I
Ambrose?
have a question for you or for Ms. Marks. I mean, we did receive comments about concerns from the 2011
Yeah.
mayor's race where there were many candidates who dropped out, notwithstanding that because they had public money, they stayed in the race, and the so-called zombie candidates. And with a history lesson about how the law was changed because there was such a backlash to that setup that essentially kept people on the ballot, notwithstanding that they weren't really running. And I wasn't involved in legislation with that in 2011. I don't know if either of you had that experience, but I am concerned about yo-yoing back and forth from, you know, there was a problem, it was solved, and now we're coming back. Are we mindful of the earlier problems, and is there a way to move forward to both give the candidates seed money, but without leading to this possibility that they'll use it to test the waters and then back out as soon as a stronger candidate makes their themselves known.
Sure.
So I'm just curious what your
and
you were
I-
here then, and if what your concerns are.
I ran a
about that.
district attorney race, so I didn't run a mayor's race, and I wasn't here on the follow-up. I paid attention to it. I ran a DA's race in that cycle, so I was very much engaged in the election. I observed all the candidates, the ones who won and the ones who didn't. I totally respect, and I've had conversations with Mr. Hill, who's I think the primary one who was very involved in fixing that. Totally respect that concern and do not discount it. I do think, in my experience, that is the only example where that's occurred. That wasn't a pattern before 2011 that I'm aware of, and it was a specific wide open mayor's race, and I don't think it was many candidates. I think there was maybe two. I'm not going to name the names, and neither of them were. Both of the. If it was more, I don't know, but. If it's the two I'm thinking of, they were both credible candidates. They were both elected officials or former officials. They weren't sort of outside folks who were abusing the program. But it was genuine that, actually the specific circumstance of that race was appointed Mayor Ed Lee had said he was not going to run. So candidates got into the race under the assumption he was not going to run. What changed and turned them into zombies, if you will, is he decided to run in August. Late, after the public deadline. So as far as I know, that's what happened, and something like that could happen again. But I think something like that could happen under any permutation of the program. So I would say I think what staff has proposed does, Commissioner Ambrose, get to your how do you balance this, which is it only allows, unlike my dream, which would be it allows candidates to apply earlier and get the grant, but only the initial grant. So still, if I read the proposal correctly, it wouldn't be until June when all candidates have filed when you could get the rest of the money. And so I don't know if this is in here. Personally, I would say if you get the grant and you drop out of the race, or you effectively do, you have to pay the money back. And if you get the grant and you decide that you're basically an unviable candidate or someone else gets in the race, what do? I think that happens. That could happen in any race. That until the deadline, you never know who's going to get in, and so I think that's a good balance. Honestly, only giving the grant. So if there's some chunk of money that gets not necessarily used as intended, it's not. I don't think it's a huge blow to the program in any way. I think it would help encourage candidates to use the program, and it wouldn't really risk large pots of money from being used on candidates who, under the current program, there are several candidates in the last year's race who you could characterize as zombies, that they got in the race thinking they would be the hot ticket. Others got in, but they stayed in the race not necessarily because of the public money, just because they had put themselves out there, or they had put their hopes and dreams. That's the nature of politics. And so I do think a little bit of a balance between those two would be fine. So I don't know if others have comments on that.
Ms. Marks, did you have anything to add on that history?
I would agree that, as far as I know also, and he would know better than I, it was just the one time. And so I personally think that the benefit outweighs the, unlikely possibility that it would happen again.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your experience.
And so, Mr. Cox, like just following up to Mr. Gollinger and Ms. Mark's comments, could you and staff take a look at what mechanisms that are currently in place, under the public financing rules that would govern the funds of someone who is becomes a zombie candidate? They decide to run, they receive public funds, and then they, for all intents and purposes, drop out. And that if there are insufficient mechanisms to be able to have them return those funds, to take Mr. Gollinger's suggestion and say that if you drop out, then you need to return, dollar for dollar everything that you received under the program.
Yeah, I think that's something we can definitely look at. I'm not 100% sure what is there right now, but I think that's something we. I'm sorry. Being told by Andrew that they would become surplus funds.
Oh, they become surplus funds. I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I think that's a concern, but I think that, as Mr. Gollinger pointed out, that's a concern in every race, not just specifically to if we change the rule here.
Great.
And then if I
Commissioner
may, I
Ambrose,
just
yeah.
have one question for staff. So regarding increasing the maximum funding a candidate can receive, you have alternatives between 210 and 270 for supervisor. I mean, I'm assuming you just pick those as brackets. I mean, I think I heard Ms. Marks say 255,
and
but it could be any, there's no particular reason why you have those two thresholds, right? It could be any number in between those.
Sure. I think that we chose the numbers based on what we've seen from candidates have spent to be successful in the race, and then I think we looked at how it would work if we're matching at 6-1. We didn't want any sort of odd numbers with respect to the matching ratios, and I think that's partially driving it. But yeah, I would think that the number isn't fixed at 270, but I think that's kind of like the benchmark that we set based on what we've seen so far in terms of what the data looks like from candidates and what they've spent to be successful and also to run a viable and competitive campaign.
Right. Correct. But if the variable that you were focusing on was the cost relative to the program resources, that would be the number that, you could adjust the risk of exceeding your appropriations by fiddling with the amount of that.
Yes, if your point is that we could not we wouldn't exceed our budget by lowering that amount, then I think that could be possible to adjust that so we don't exceed the $9.7 million over a 4-year appropriation. That could be one approach.
Right. So your table 8 at 210 and 1.2 million, you're estimating, and these are estimates, that you'd hit 8.2 million with the 270 and 1.5 million for the mayor's race. Your cost estimate is 9.7 and 50,000. So anyway, I just want to make sure I understood that there wasn't some magic about those two particular numbers, that there could be a number in between those.
Yeah, I think that it has to do with the matchable amount because we're in a 6-1 matching ratio. We can change that. It would just kind of have a weird cap where under our current system, there's a 1-to-1 matching tier at the very end. So we wanted to avoid any sort of weird tiered system where we give 6-1, but at the very end, we either don't match or it's a 1-to-1 match. So we wanted to make the numbers kind of look neat that way. So I think that's why we chose those two.
I see. Okay.
Could you run it at 250 and just to see what that would look like?
Sure.
And understanding that would have an impact on the matching, like 6-1, and like how weird would it be?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Thank you. So I'd like to invite Mr. Wright up.
Hi. Thank you to the Ethics Commission. Thank you, Chair Chu. Thank you to the Ethics staff. I wanted to offer comment on the Ethics staff report that we're reviewing today, particularly in regards to the set of proposals that Supervisor Gordon Marr is working on to move forward at the Board of Supervisors. First, I would say thank you to the staff for putting together this report. On the whole, we agree with both the overall analysis and most of the conclusions that were reached in the report for the list of recommendations. There are a couple points of difference that I just wanted to specifically address here. So first, we agree with the fifth recommendation of increasing the initial IEC to $350,000 for supervisorial races and $1.7 million for mayoral races. However, we feel that it's important that we also increase the maximum public funds a candidate can receive by the same amount that we're increasing the IEC by, because unless we do that, we're in effect diluting the impact of the public funds based on the overall amount that a campaign could raise. So where we ended up in our proposals, and we did request a BLA analysis of our proposals that I will have ready to share with the Commission probably next week. We ended up somewhere in the middle. So rather than $210,000 for supervisor, $270,000 for supervisor, we ended up recommending $255,000, which lands somewhere in the middle and matches the increased amount from the IEC for supervisor. So that, in effect, is a $100,000 increase from the current total public funds available to work alongside the $100,000 increase to the initial IEC. We did agree with the increased amount for alternative one for mayoral races because that matches the amount that the IEC is being raised by. So we would agree with that. The other thing I would highlight is we had a different conclusion on the amount of a contribution that should be matched. We agree with the goal of decreasing the overall amount from $500. However, we reached the conclusion that a $200 level would be more effective to the goals of the program because it does move us towards further sort of incentivizing or empowering small dollar donors without having the effect of reducing the impact of an individual's maximum contribution. So if we're matching a $500 contribution and we're only matching the first $100 at a 6-to-1 rate, the total value of that contribution under the ethics staff proposals would be $1,100. Under the current program, it would be $1,500. And if it was matched up to $200 at a 6-to-1 rate for our set of recommendations, it would stay at $1,500 while still empowering smaller dollar donors. So that is one other point of difference that we reached. We do, of course, agree with decreasing the amount. We just think it's important to think about how that impacts the overall
I'm sorry,
value
Edward,
of the contribution.
I just want to make sure I understand that at the $200 amount, at the 6-to-1 match, how do you get to $1,500?
So it would match the $200 at 6-to-1, which would be worth $1,200, and then the $300 remainder would be $300, so the overall worth of the contribution.
Oh, I see. Oh, you're talking about a $500 contribution?
Yes, yeah. So if you look at the example of a maximum contribution at $500, in the current program, that's worth $1,500.
Right.
And at a matching up to $200 at a 6-to-1 rate, it would still be worth $1,500. Whereas if you only matched $100, it would be worth $1,100. So we view that as sort of a step backwards for the impact of the public funds.
Right. Actually, with my math, though, at $500, you're matching the $200 at 6-to-1, so that's $1,200. So 500 plus 1,200 is 1,700.
Yes, I'm sorry, you are correct. Yeah.
So you're increasing the impact.
It would be a slight increase, yes.
Yeah, so it would be an increase of 40%.
Correct.
I'm sorry, it's like from 1,500 to 1,700, and I think that's kind of going the opposite direction of what we're trying to do here, which is to empower the smaller donations. So a $500 donation is getting doubled, and it has an impact of $1,500, but under the 6-to-1 match, it has an impact of $1,700. So that's even more than what is the current impact of $500 at this point. So how does that help the smaller donors?
Because if you look at the percentage increase of the impact for a maximum contribution versus a smaller contribution, a contribution of $200 or less, the percentage increase of the impact is going to be greater for the smaller contributions than it would be for the maximum contribution. In the same way that it
But
is.
yeah, on a percentage basis,
Yeah.
but from an absolute dollar basis, you're getting $200 more for $200, for $500, as opposed to the current regime.
Right.
As opposed to as opposed to the current regime of 2 to 1.
Correct.
So-
So I think we're open to looking at other numbers as well that would try to keep it the same. Our motivation is we didn't want to reduce the impact of a maximum individual contribution in changes made to the program, which under the set of proposals for matching up to $100 at a 6-to-1 rate, it's actually a $400 reduction in the amount of funds you'd receive.
Yes. Commissioner Lee? No? Okay. Yeah, so I think the concern I would have is that, $500 is a lot of money, and if we look at the chart on page 6, the number of people, it's 73% of the mayoral contributions, individual contributions, were in the $400 to $500 range, and those who are contributing, it's not exact numbers here, but it's only 4% from 0 to 99 and 8% from 100 to 199%. So of that 8%, I think that a certain portion of them would be giving 100 as opposed to 199, or if you're going to get to 200, it's 12%. So I think we need to strike a balance between a disproportionate reduction to the impact of a $500 contribution, but also empowering the impact of a $100 contribution because of the gross disparity, I think, that we see in this chart.
Yeah, I think we absolutely agree with that. Our concern is just, again, not wanting to reduce the impact of a maximum contribution, but rather lift up the impact of smaller contributions.
Right, but the dollars have to come from somewhere, right? It's like if one goes up, the other goes down. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a question. So if I were a candidate, if I look at this chart, if 4% of my supporters are writing small checks, I'm going to spend a lot more time cultivating the $500 donors, right? Because
Under the current program, yes. Yeah.
So the whole idea of bringing in the folks who are being left behind is that they have equal footing, so to speak. So that's why I'm still having questions on, the $500 versus the $100 or $200 or $150, because if the idea is to bring along the folks who's been left out, what you're saying is the candidates are still going to spend more time cultivating the big donors because under your scenario, they're going to bring in more bucks than the small donors.
Well, the difference between the scenario we are considering versus the recommendation of the staff proposal is not the difference between $100 and $500. It's the difference between $100 and $200. So in the sense that donors who can donate up to $200 but not up to $500, we would be further empowering those donors in a program that matches up to $200 of a contribution versus one that matches up to $100 of a contribution in terms of providing a counterweight to the max donors.
Commissioner Ambrose?
The only thing I wanted to say, this chart that we're referring to, which is on page 4 of the staff report, it's your chart number 1 and chart number 2. I'm not sure I'm reading it, but I don't think that the 5% and the 10% of, say, 15% of donations that are under $200, that's the number of contributors. It's the value, and so the dollar amount affects those percentages. And I was curious, if you do have numbers of contributors that fall into each bracket? I'm assuming that the number of people who give money under $100 is a hell of a lot more than the number of people who give money of $400 to $500.
Right. And I think that in crafting our models, it was difficult to get data from the contributors that gave between $0 and $100 because I think the rules as written don't require candidates to itemize those contributions. And so getting the raw number of people who gave, say $10 or $15, it's really challenging to get that. My colleague Tyler could speak more to that if you have further questions. But in short, I think the answer is we put this chart here deliberately because we couldn't generate the number of contributors for that subset of data of between 0 and 100.
Okay. And then to the speaker, I understand your point right now under the current program. If you are able to generate a $500 contribution, that's worth $1,500 to your campaign. You're suggesting that whatever the new math is, that those contributions of that amount, which are around 70% of campaign finances, come from that size donation, the value of the money, that's the one thing the chart does show, that isn't reduced, because that could have the result of net reducing the amount of money that's available to candidates who are receiving public financing, because they're, I understand. I'm not sure if you can get there with the changes with a $200 cap, though. So.
Yeah, so our hope is that the impact of these reforms of increasing the matching ratio and decreasing the amount of the contribution that's matched is that this chart would look very different, and that a much larger share of any campaign's funds would come from folks who are donating in smaller contribution amounts. So we, again, agree with the conclusion that we need to reduce the amount of the contribution that's being matched alongside increasing the matching ratio. I think it's just about finding what is the right balance there, what is the right number. And in terms of thinking through the impacts on a campaign, I think a good place to start in these reforms is doing it in such a way that we're not actually decreasing the impact of the current contributions, but rather looking at how we can further lift up smaller dollar donors. And another point I would raise is that I do think that there is a meaningful difference between someone who's able to donate $110 versus someone who's able to donate $500. And the idea that we also want to match at a ratio the full $110 donation makes a difference versus just matching up to 100. So that was part of our thinking of just where do you draw that line? Who do you consider a smaller dollar donor? And where we ended up was $200, and we thought that would be a both viable and impactful way to approach it, which was a different number than where the ethics staff ended up. But I think we both agree with the same goals.
So I would like to ask staff to look at 150. My rough back of the envelope calculation is that a match at 2-to-1 at $150 nets you $800 total, because you can double the 150, so 500 plus 300 is 800, and that at 6-to-1 that's worth $900 and gets you to 1,400. So it's not 1,500, but it's also not disproportionately valuing the $200 contribution, the $500 contribution at the expense of the $100 contribution, because the $100 contribution in the 6-to-1 matching ratio at, if you're matching 200, is it's still worth more, but the $500 contribution is worth even more than what it was in the current scenario, which I think is counter to some of the goals that the Commission it thinks is important, or at least I think is important. So I'd like to ask staff to come back with a different proposal at 150, and if you could share your analysis from BLA, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I don't know if you had other comments. I had one more question for you from a process standpoint. If you had other feedback on the proposals that staff had put forth.
I would just stress again our view that the staff proposals were correct in the amounts that they propose increasing the initial IECs by, but that we feel strongly that we would need to match those increases by the same amount in increases to total public funds available to avoid diluting the effect of those public funds. So I would just stress that again. Aside from that, I think we agree with all the other conclusions of the staff's report, and I look forward to sharing the BLA analysis as soon as the final draft is ready, which I expect to be next week.
So just to be clear, you were proposing 255 for the Board of Supervisors and 1.5 for the mayor?
I believe it was
Right.
1.7 for mayor.
1.7?
Yeah.
One 1.5?
Oh, no, excuse me. You were correct. Yeah, 1.2 for
1.5.
mayor and 255 for supervisor.
1 point, how much? 1.2 or 1.5?
So it's 1.7 for the IEC
Yes,
for mayor,
okay, and then
350 for
1.2.
the IEC for supervisor, 1.2 for the maximum public funds available for mayor, and 255 for the
255,
maximum
okay.
funds available for supervisor.
And then from a process, I wanted to make sure I understood your remarks at the beginning of your comments, and that was, is Supervisor Marr going to be introducing his own ordinance on these topics at the board? I just want to make sure that I understood what you were saying there.
Yes, so we've been waiting to receive the final draft of the BLA analysis before updating the draft legislation. We had previously drafted legislation that was looking at both the phase one sort of recommendations that the commission's considered and the phase two recommendations. We held off on introducing that, and instead, we're happy to come on board as the sponsor of the phase one ordinance that's now moving forward at the board. So our intention was, after we receive both the staff recommendations and the BLA analysis, to then redraft that legislation to be kind of in line with the conclusions.
So how do you envision the process working with the Ethics Commission then? Because we currently have, like, all of the work here is the basis for a proposed ordinance that we would then review and discuss and vote on, and then could go to the Board of Supervisors or we could go to the ballot. But from a legislative standpoint, if your supervisor is introducing a separate standalone measure, how do we reconcile the two, and how do you envision that process going forward?
So any introduction that was made at the Board of Supervisors addressing these topics would then be referred to the Ethics Commission before it went to a board committee or the board voted on it. The difference is essentially, is it introduced as a departmental ordinance from the Ethics Department, or is it introduced through our office? It's just a distinction in the method of introduction, but the process is the same. It would still go to the Ethics Commission first.
So you are not contemplating having two, like, you draft an ordinance and then the Ethics Commission drafts an ordinance, because that to me seems to be a very inefficient way to do things.
Yes. So our intention is to work closely with the commission and the department. We're not trying to have competing legislation.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that point, because it doesn't seem to make any sense for us to be working in parallel. Because typically, as I understand, I would ask the deputy city attorney to weigh in terms of the process. As I understand it, in my time on the commission, is that if the commission is considering legislation, then we would discuss the ordinance, have public comment, and then we vote on it by supermajority. Then we send it over to the Board of Supervisors, who would then take it up. And if there are any changes, unless it's adopted kind of wholesale, any changes will then have to come back to the commission, because it has to be approved by supermajority on both sides. Mm-hmm. So since we are kind of engaged in that process here now with the current draft proposal of content from the staff, my hope and expectation would be that at the next meeting we would consider an actual ordinance, and that when we have supermajority approval, we could send that over to the Board of Supervisors for its review process. Andrew, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely a fair point. So our intention in updating the drafting of our legislation is twofold. One, that we already had legislation drafted, just updating it to match what was already introduced, to take out the portions that were already introduced through this commission, and to reflect the additional analysis that was presented. And second, to share with the commission and ethics staff our thinking on this topic. But if if the intention of the commission is to move forward with an ordinance at the next commission meeting in May, I agree that it probably wouldn't make sense for us to introduce a separate legislative proposal at the board, given that both would come before the commission and then the board.
Yeah, I mean, that to me would make the most sense because we are on track here to consider an ordinance based on staff work for next month. But the idea would be to incorporate feedback and answer some of the questions that commissioners raised, but that we would come back to consider an ordinance. Hopefully, we could do that at the next month's meeting. Andrew?
Yeah, just to quickly clarify, so I think we have a variety of options here, and I don't think we're excluding any potential outcomes yet. But in terms of what you want to, or what the commission would prefer to see at the next meeting, it's clear the commission wants to see an actual ordinance, actual legal text. Now, is it your preference that there will be a proposal from the staff and then a proposal from Supervisor Marr's office, or is it your preference that you would have a single ordinance that reflects input from both parties?
I would prefer a single ordinance just for clarity's sake, and if there needs to be different color coding, to say that this is staff's proposal, or if it's the staff proposal and it's cleaner to have comments come from Supervisor Marr's office. However, Brian, you and Mr. Ford would like to, cooperate and, collaborate with Mr. Wright here, I think would be, I don't want to tell the painters how to paint.
Yeah, no, I think that's something we can definitely work towards, putting that one proposal together for the next meeting.
Any other comments or from fellow commissioners, concerns about that approach? So just to recap then, for the following meeting, and we raised a lot of different points here, and that we would, I would like to ask for a draft ordinance, and I leave that up to the Deputy City Attorney, policy staff, and Mr. Wright to determine how best to frame that. I think in past practice has been that there was a staff recommended ordinance, and then there would be proposed changes or suggest, if there's a difference of opinion from supervisors, staffs, that they could then, attach that so we could see, who is wanting and taking what position on which provision. I think would be very helpful. Okay, great. All right.
Any further questions for me?
Any further questions for Mr. Wright? No.
Right. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. All right. Why don't we take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back at 3:20.
SF Gov TV, San Francisco Government Television.
Presentation and discussion of agenda item number 5, discussion of proposed regulations and the staff attachment.
Thank you, Chair Chu. Item 5 is an item that Pat Ford, again, was worked on in preparation for this meeting. I just wanted to highlight for you what the item is. Our hope is that you may have a chance to look at them today, receive public comment. These are draft proposed regulations that cannot be acted on today. Our regulations, you may recall, require a 10-day notice. And so the goal was to have the list of areas identified for you where we are proposing some regulatory cleanup and some changes to elicit any kind of specific comment, suggestions, questions from you, from members of the public, and then to revise as necessary, notice those changes, and then have them available for you at the May meeting for your action if you want to take action at that time. The package that's with agenda item 5 basically separates these proposed changes into 3 categories. First, they are implementing regulations for the Anti-Corruption and Accountability Ordinance. These would be regulations that would be created or amend current law to help implement the law that took effect, that was enacted in 2018. So Table 2A on page 2 lists the specific sections that would be changed, that these are new provisions or new regulations or updated regulations, and then it describes the purpose. The second area is general clarifying and interpreting regulations to just generally clarify and interpret various provisions of the code. Again, the number of the regulation is listed and the purpose. And then there are also some non-substantive updates that a number of them were holdovers from prior changes to the code that we have not kept our regulations in pace with. And so these are cleanups, the cleanup changes that really need to happen to just conform the regulations as they exist with the current code. I am reminded that now that we have both policy members on board and have expanded our bandwidth generally, this is something that it will be top of mind going forward regularly as changes to the law are enacted so that we don't have regulations that are out of sync with the code sections. So with that, I just wanted to highlight for the policy team that these are in front of you. I think we may have some public comment today, but happy to answer any questions if I can, but also to just encourage any specific questions or discussion that we can bring forward and respond to at the next meeting with specific regulations to address those questions if they haven't been addressed here.
I just had a couple questions. One is with regard to the education and communication component of rolling out these new requirements. And so, for example, there are some notification requirements that agencies now have, and so I imagine that there's been a whole plan put together, but if you could speak to that at next month's meeting, just to give some highlights, I think that would be really helpful, because there are certain burdens that have been placed upon the community to make these filings, and I want to make sure that it's not going to be a gotcha situation. It's like, well, I didn't know about it because no one told me.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a sort of a slight preview, there is a note in the executive director's report this month. Again, now that we have 2 new members added to our engagement and compliance staff, and John Kim is here in the audience today as one of our 2 new members of the team, that is definitely something that has now moved to the top of the list. We are working with, for example, the Board of Supervisors, the clerk of the Board of Supervisors office, to implement procedures for disclosure requirements and to sync requirements throughout the city. So we have staff that are now developing those outreach and information plans to work closely with departments.
Thank
and
you.
We can certainly provide more information about that at next month's meeting, more
Maybe,
specifically.
Yeah, maybe Mr. Kim could present. No pressure. My second question, and this is this goes to some of the behested payment filings, but in specific, that's what sparked the question in my mind. But I think it would apply generally to these regulations, and that is, what is the penalty, if any, for a failure to file or a delayed filing? So I know that there are late filing fees, and I think that there are, in some circumstances, penalties for failing to file. But in particular, with regard to these behested payment reports, these are reports made by either an elected official or a company or an individual who's made a behested payment at the request of, at the behest of an elected official. And the concern I have is that if no report is made, then there will be no sunlight on that payment. So if there is a large contribution, charitable contribution made to the mayor's pet charity at the behest of the mayor, and that's not in the ordinance requires reporting, but if that's not reported, there's really no way, unless a Form 803 is filed at the state level, and that we're actually cross-checking. So I'd like to understand what the mechanism would be to ensure that there would be consequences for failing to file, if there are any already. You don't have to answer now specifically, but if there are already, or if, do we need to consider incorporating some?
I would just add, there ongoing discussion here with the city attorney, DCH Shed. I think the same provisions under current law would apply if there is a failure to file a form that's required under city law, or a failure to take an action that's required under city law. We would, it could potentially be complaint-driven process. Mm-hmm. We would certainly take a look at it. We have investigative resources that would look at it. So I think that's consistent with the current law that we have, and the provisions would apply to penalties.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So the normal penalties and process that apply to, say, a conflict of interest violation would also apply to the failure to file these forms. One thing that, in dovetailing or echoing your prior comments about sort of outreach and education and engagement, one thing that's very unique about these behested payment provisions is they apply to city officials, which is not abnormal. They apply to people who make donations, and they also apply to people who receive the donations.
Right.
And since we're talking about behested payments, some of those recipients may be, for example, nonprofit organizations. So for this, it may be an entirely kind of new construct for them. So.
Yeah, so I think that it'll be extremely important to make sure that the community, the regulated community, is made aware of and understands what their obligations would be under this. Okay, so that's all I had. Questions or? Commissioner Lee?
I just have a quick call for clarification. For Regulations 1.104-3, definition of immediate family, I seem to recall that the definition included more than just the spouse or partner or dependent children. I thought we had included parents and siblings. If not, I would like to propose that we add the siblings and parents in the definition of immediate family.
Which section is that? I'm sorry, Commissioner Lee?
Page 2, the
Commissioner Lee, can
just the definition.
Oh, I
It
see.
was not included in any of the attachment. That attachment, page 2. Sounds like it was
Oh,
the
it's
existing.
agenda item 5, page 7. I see at the very top.
7 page. Yeah, page 7. Sorry. Definition of immediate family.
Yeah, that, well, doesn't show a change, so.
That's the existing one, but I thought we had the discussion to add other family members into the definition. Or was it?
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly why it was included in this document, but staff is not proposing any changes to this definition. And it is a fairly standard definition of immediate family for campaign finance and conflict of interest purposes.
But I thought we had a discussion to add the siblings and parents in.
I think we can certainly look to see
Yeah,
why it's
can you
not,
do that?
if it's
Yeah.
not consistent with other provisions, and
Right.
should it be,
Okay.
and what the
Okay.
implications
Can you
might
please
be. But we'll be happy to address
Okay,
that in the
thank
next
you.
months.
And I'm not parents, but siblings, I mean, my siblings are independent 60-year-old beings that maybe don't even share my political interests, so I wouldn't consider them part of my immediate family.
I think after the campaign finance fiasco and currently still going on, siblings are sort of being used or included in some of the behested payments and some of the other campaign usage. But definitely the parents are included. But right now more and more people are looking in the siblings because they're part of the business in some small business or business operations. And that's why for campaign finance reform purposes, under family definition, siblings are included. So I'd like us to explore that.
We can do some research on what the discrepancy or differences are and what the
Yeah.
purpose is.
What the president.
I had one last question, actually, in Regulation 1.104-6, the trust account limit. So it's on page 7 of Agenda Item 5. The current public financing ordinance that is at the Rules Committee, now, if that is passed by the board, then I think this would, since we eliminated the trust accounts, that this provision would then go away. Is that right?
I think this is an update to bring it into, to comport with the current
The current law,
provision.
yes,
The current law. So,
Okay.
yes, presumably, we would have to update these if these were to change again.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had. Any other comments? Commissioner Ambrose or Commissioner Lee? No. Would like to call for public comment on agenda item number 5.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Anita Mayo from Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman. I would like to summarize my written comment submitted April 10th regarding the proposed regulations. First, the ACAO requires any person making a behested contribution of $5,000 or more to a ballot measure committee or a committee making independent expenditures to disclose to the committee the office and name of the city elected officer who requested the contribution. The definition of ballot measure committee should be clarified to indicate that the term applies to a committee primarily formed to support or oppose a measure. And the term committee making independent expenditures should refer to a committee that has made at least $1,000 in independent expenditures over the 12-month period. Under the proposed reg, the contributor must make the required disclosure to the receiving committee at the time that the contribution is made. This would impose an unreasonable burden on a donor who typically would not be aware that such disclosure is required. Since under state law, a committee receiving a contribution totaling $5,000 or more must send a written notice to the donor within 2 weeks or within a week for contributions of $10,000 or more received during the late reporting period, this same notice could be used to inform donors of the requirement to disclose the name of the city elected officer at whose behest the donation was made. The proposed regulation requires the receiving committee to continue to file the same form disclosing the same name of the elected official who requested that contributions be made if a donor makes multiple contributions in a calendar year. Such filings creates an unnecessary burden for the receiving committee. A single filing triggered by the initial $5,000 should suffice to inform the public of the name of the elected official who asked the donor to make the contribution or contributions to the committee. Unlike the provision requiring the disclosure of bundled contributions, the section of the ordinance does not require a listing of the contributions, merely the name of the city elected officers who requested that the contributions be made. Under the proposed reg for primarily formed committees, the term election cycle appears to mean the entire time the committee is registered with the Secretary of State to support or oppose a candidate or a measure. If that is the correct meaning, then it would be helpful for the regulation to clarify that additional donations of $10,000 or more by a business entity to the same committee would not trigger the repeated filing of the same information about that business entity by the receiving committee. And the definition of election cycle as applied to a general purpose committee is still somewhat confusing and needs additional clarification. And just 2 more quick points. The proposed regulation clarifies the definition of affiliate, a new term added by the ACAO with respect to contractors doing business with the city. Under the previous version of the ordinance, the contractor contribution ban also applied to a committee that was sponsored or controlled by the party to the contract, but that language was actually deleted when the ordinance was adopted. So the corresponding language in that regulation should thus be deleted. And finally, because of that, the notice language in the proposed regulation, which refers to a committee that is sponsored or controlled by the party, should also be deleted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mayo. Do you have copies of your comments that you could provide or
I do
email?
have one if
Or if you could email them.
I emailed them. Yeah, I
Okay.
emailed them on Wednesday the 10th, but they just didn't get duplicated.
Okay.
I just found out. So can you have them? Okay.
Okay.
So, yes, Ms. Pelham will deliver them.
Yeah, so if, Ms. Pelham, if you could email Ms.
Thank you.
Mayo's comments to all of us, that would be terrific. And also, Mr. Cox, I'd like to ask you to reach out to Ms. Mayo and with Mr. Ford to discuss her thoughtful feedback. Thank you. Any other public comment? Agenda item number 6, the discussion of the month staff policy report.
Commissioners, this is the regular monthly report highlighting some of the initiatives that the policy team has underway. Many of the items we've discussed today already, but happy to attempt to answer any questions if you have them.
Just to recapitulate what you'd said earlier, the pending ordinance is hopefully to be taken up next week, we hope, by the Rules Committee.
I think we'll learn more, and as soon as we get word of that, I'm sure we'll have notice to you all to keep you informed.
And then on page 3, the trustee election disclosures implementation, is there a timeline on the implementation of the new public disclosure requirements?
Yes, that's also something I've addressed slightly, some specificity in my agenda item 8, the executive director's
Okay,
report, but
great.
that work is underway with our engagement and compliance team as we speak.
That's right. Terrific. Okay. Thank you. Any public comment or other questions from commissioners? Public comment on agenda item number 6? Moving on to agenda item number 7, discussion of monthly staff enforcement report, including an update on various programmatic and operational highlights of the enforcement program's activities since the last monthly meeting. Mr.
Thank you,
Pierce.
Chair Chu and Commissioners. A couple of training matters to highlight for you. Over the course of the last month, we have hosted 2 significant trainings. You asked Chair Chu last month about staffing decisions within the Enforcement Division, and we noted that we had elevated Investigator Jeff Zumwalt, excuse me, from to the position of Senior Investigator. So Jeff Zumwalt provided to the Enforcement Division a training of about 3 hours based on his work of more than a decade in law enforcement, both as a police officer and ultimately at the end of his career in law enforcement as a police detective. And that training consisted of instruction and best practices in terms of how to prepare for interviews, what the overall goals of an interview might be, particular forms of conduct that the interviewer might look for in terms of how to make decisions about how to proceed with the interview, and generally to encourage the team to develop ways of treating interviews as opportunities to get witnesses and respondents to provide relevant information. In other words, to treat the interview as a conversation designed to elicit information. So that training was extremely valuable for our team, as is Jeff's contribution as an investigator with considerable experience. The other training that the Enforcement Division hosted included members of other divisions within the Ethics Commission. That training was provided by 2 of our counterparts from the Fair Political Practices Commission, our counterparts at the state level in Sacramento. And so we had the Assistant Chief Counsel present to staff about the substantive legal issues governing conflicts of interest. So local law incorporates 2 provisions of state law in the Government Code. One is Section 87-100, and following the other is Section 1090. And we incorporate those in Article 3 of the Campaign and Governmental Conduct Code. So the state was able to provide highly relevant training about what the legal provisions are, both within the statute and within the regulations, all of which apply locally for staff, both to advise the regulated community about their obligations respecting financial conflicts of interest, and for the Enforcement Division to investigate allegations of conflict of interest violations. So there was a second part of that training that included the supervising special investigator from the FPPC who spoke exclusively with the Enforcement Division about best practices in terms of how to identify when conflict violations have occurred. And then turning to the enforcement statistics, you'll see that for the first time in a while, the division now has open more investigations than we do have complaints awaiting our triage. So we have now 75 complaints for which the Ethics Commission has not yet made a determination as to jurisdiction or as to the merits of the allegations, has not rendered a decision about whether to dismiss, investigate, or refer, whereas we have 87 matters that are under open investigation at various stages of investigation, some of which have just been opened by virtue of referral to the city attorney and district attorney, others of which are in the final stages of resolution with active efforts to settle those matters through a negotiated stipulation with respondents. You can see that the amount of time overall that it takes the Enforcement Division to conduct the triage of new complaints is hovering around 7 months. As always, we aspire to bring that number down and fully intend to, particularly given opportunities to reform processes, which the division will be spearheading shortly. And you will see as well that in light of the division's ability to resolve several of the older matters on its docket, we managed to bring the amount of time it takes us to complete an investigation down below 15 months. I'm happy to field any questions that you might have.
I think it would be helpful for me, and I think also for my fellow commissioners, if we could put I don't know if, Mr. Shen, if this is the appropriate time to ask this, but to explore different ways that the commission can help in terms of reducing the backlog or the number of cases over, a year, and looking at the type, looking at the fixed penalty schedule, for example, exploring different ways to help bring more of these cases to resolution a little more quickly. I think having a dialogue about that might be very helpful.
So I think the question is, if the commission wants to engage in a process, for example, of expanding existing policies, we operate currently under something called the fixed penalty policy, which enables a streamlined handling of a small subset of the kinds of cases that come before us. If the commission wished to expand the number and kinds of matters that were governed by the fixed penalty policy, or if the commission wished to convey its ambitions with regard to prioritizing certain kinds of violations over others, what would be our legal obligations in terms of engaging the public? Is that the question?
Engaging the public, but also I would seek recommendations from staff to say, from the enforcement team, what are some of the things that could be helpful in your work to bring these investigations on the review of preliminary matters, to be efficient. How do you become more efficient and more effective, and what role can the commission play in facilitating that process?
Exactly how we would go about having that discussion? Is
yes.
that?
Can we do that in public?
Sure, absolutely. We can certainly address general enforcement policies and approaches in an open session item. The confidentiality obligations are simply triggered with respect to discussions about a single complaint or a given complaint, but we can certainly have larger, big picture discussions.
So I think it's very helpful to know that the number of complaints, that are age 13 to 15 months or, relate to sunshine, and then, could we have a substantive discussion then from a commission standpoint, like what are the ones, because we can't boil the ocean, and that there's limited time and resources to be devoted to these investigations, and how do we prioritize, those resources to make the most impact, and are there ways from a structural standpoint that we can help facilitate the resolution of smaller matters, for example, through the fixed penalty?
Yeah, I appreciate the suggestion and the commission's willingness to engage in a process that might expand the fixed penalty policy, or that might communicate to staff preferences about the kinds of matters that the enforcement division might prioritize above others. If I've not said before, I mean, the commission's current practice has been to treat all complaints roughly equally, and to take them in the order that they arrive. The view, I believe, has been that we have an obligation to complainants equally. We have an obligation to the public to take seriously all the complaints that come before us, and a way of reassuring the public that we do that is to take those complaints first in, first out, and to move through the entire docket with all due diligence. But if the commission believes that the enforcement division might better secure the trust of the public through some alternative approach to handling the complaints that come before us, we're certainly open to that conversation.
So maybe we can get that on the agenda at a future meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any public comment on this item? Okay. Agenda item number 8, discussion of Executive Director's report.
Thank you, Chair Chu. I have a number of updates since the report was provided to you earlier this week. This morning, Deputy Director Gayatri Taikandil and I attended the budget subcommittee meeting of the Committee on Information Technology, who last night issued their recommendations for funding for proposals that had been submitted. There were something like 20-odd departments that submitted proposals, and based on the recommendation and the action that the subcommittee took today, they did not fund the request that we submitted to make a disclosure meaningful and for our data sharing and analysis for an informed public. It appears that this is a year in the subcommittee's view that there are a number of very large projects that require technology fixes in the city, and that there are a number of large departments that have to work together to create new systems that are at risk of disrupting fundamental city services. So it sounds like this is a year where they had a great number of asks, and they did not prioritize our ask as one that fit into this year's bucket. That's obviously very concerning to us, because it is a critical process that if we do not have funding to achieve the work that project envisions, a number of very critical public disclosure initiatives that we've been working on will come to a halt precisely at the time when we're moving into another mayoral election. And I think that's obviously a disservice to those who've come to rely on the information in such a fabulous way with dashboards and work that the city's been doing to create accessible information. So the COIT full committee will meet next week to finalize the recommendations. Based on what we heard today, it was not our sense that there was probably going to be much latitude for that committee to make a different recommendation than the one that their subcommittee made today. That said, however, Gayatri and I, following the meeting, went and met directly with the mayor's office, our budget analyst, to walk through what we understood had just happened and to try and understand what other options there might be. So I would say that we are not at the end of this discussion yet. We are having direct conversations with the mayoral team, the budget and policy team. I think there is understanding of the significance of this project, but we are not by any means at the end of the conversation. But I did want to inform you about that development earlier today. That was not what we'd hoped to hear. So we will be working as hard as we can, as aggressively as we can, to try and make sure that we're able to get these funds to keep this project up above, on deck and completed in the coming year. It is really critical to a number of our operations and our external public disclosure responsibilities. So that's the only update we have at this point on the budget. We are continuing on a variety of fronts to still understand and to talk with the mayor's office and respond to questions about information that helps them understand our operations and our budget asks.
Yeah, that's very disappointing and dismaying to hear that news. So please let us know if there's anything that we can do to help in those efforts to secure the funding. And I don't know if this is possible, but is it possible to take this portion of this ask and incorporate that into the regular budget?
We are exploring that option because we need to, unfortunately, if it doesn't come out of the COIT bucket, then we are looking to see what other bucket it can come out of, and that might just be general fund. But we certainly had a very, I think, helpful and constructive discussion with the mayor's office after the meeting this morning and when we learned this news. So again, I think we'll be very much interested in reporting back to you as we get closer to more decisions over the next several weeks, and we'll certainly have another update at the May meeting. But if there is other information we can provide to you before then, we will be sure to do that.
And how much was the request to the COIT budget?
It was for a 3-year limited term project to accomplish the project over 3 years, and it would have been $225,000 per fiscal year for that each of the 3 years.
Okay. Thank you.
Separately, on the engagement and compliance front, we have a number of activities ongoing, which is it's been a very busy month with, as you can imagine, the annual statement of economic interest filings that have been due under state law earlier this month, just a week or so ago. And we have the latest figures this morning show that we had about 92% of the electronic filers filing on time, and about 85% filing their Ethics and Sunshine certifications. So we are in the process, the staff's been in the process of going through the list to make sure that there are not duplications and misinformation or filing errors. But we are reaching out already to those who did not appear to file to make sure they're aware of the obligations that they have, and particularly for members who are members of boards and commissions, the no file, no vote requirement that applies to them. We've also been in touch with departmental filing officers to make sure that they're aware of that. So we will continue to keep you informed about that work as it continues, but it was a very busy filing season, and we appreciated the engagement and compliance team's effort to help people understand the compliance obligations that they have.
So, excuse me, Director Pelham. So, for those 8% who have not filed, and if they do hold a board or a appointed position, that if they haven't filed, that they can't vote. So, they have been notified that.
Yes, our communications with everybody has reminded them of that. So we will be, as the need, if the need continues, we will be increasing our conversations more directly with those individuals to make sure that they are, in fact, not unwittingly or stepping into violations of that law. So we'll be doing much more outreach across the board.
Great, thank you.
As needed. I mentioned earlier, John Kim is here. If you have particular questions about the lobbying program update, he has taken on that role with gusto, and really taking a look at filings and new system enhancements. And I will just leave it to John if there is anything you want to add, or if you have any specific questions about that program. But it is just very heartening and terrific to see staff, an increased bandwidth, that we now are able to pick up some of the programs that we haven't been able to be as active on because of sort of triaging through our engagement and compliance activities. Is there any highlights at all? Okay, if there aren't any questions. I will also mention, you had mentioned earlier, Chair Chu, about the trustee elections, and Johnny Hosey has been actively working with candidates for various trustee elections. These are those boards that have new disclosure requirements, Health Service Board and Retirement in the city that have elections coming up, and so he's been providing information and assistance to them, and so we're hoping that will be up and running and helpful to folks who are now subject to these disclosure requirements in this season. The elections, I think, are coming up in May, the first of them in May. So we're on track to get some resources and information and tools to those individuals. I think that's a highlight. The highlights for this month. I am happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? No? Any questions? No. Any public comment? Okay, no public comment. Agenda item number 9, discussion and possible action regarding status of complaints received or initiated by the Ethics Commission. Possible closed session. Is there any motion to go into closed session? No. Okay. Ms. Deputy City Attorney Shen, do we need to take public comment on this item? Number 9? We do. Okay. Public comment on agenda item number 9? No. Okay. Agenda item number 10, discussion and possible action on items for future meetings. Commissioners? No. Public comment? No public comment. Agenda item number 11, additional opportunity for public comment on matters appearing or not appearing on the agenda pursuant to Ethics Commission Bylaws, Article 7, Section 2. No public comment. Motion to adjourn? Okay, we're adjourned.